The confession fell across the Family Feud studio like a thunderclap in a cathedral, sudden, devastating, and carrying the weight of 4 generations of sacrifice. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, his confident smile cracking as he processed what he'd just heard. The bright studio lights that normally energized the room suddenly felt harsh, illuminating not just entertainment, but the catastrophic end of an American dream that had taken a century to build and moments to destroy. 51-year-old Sofia Petrov stood at the contestant podium in her carefully maintained business suit, every thread speaking of dignity preserved despite circumstances that should have shattered it. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back in a style that whispered of better days, and her blue eyes, the same eyes that had watched ships leave Russian harbors and counted American dollars for the first time, carried a weight that expensive clothes could no longer hide. "We asked 100 people," Steve had announced with his trademark enthusiasm. "Name something you lost that you can never get back." He'd expected the typical responses that would generate knowing nods and maybe some tears. Childhood, perhaps. A loved one. Youth. Time. The kinds of losses that were universal, poignant. The sort that would light up the board and remind everyone of life's precious, irreplaceable moments. Instead, Sofia looked directly into his eyes with the haunted gaze of someone who had betrayed not just herself, but the ghosts of everyone who had come before her, and spoke 8 words that would transform this episode from entertainment into something approaching historical tragedy. "My great-grandmother's American dream." The studio fell into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very concept of sound. Not the comfortable quiet of reflection, but the devastating silence that follows the confession of sins so large they eclipse individual guilt and become generational betrayal. Steve's perpetual motion stilled as he recognized that this wasn't just about personal loss. This was about the destruction of a legacy that had survived revolution, immigration, and a century of sacrifice. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't part of any show format they'd prepared for. Contestants were supposed to share relatable losses, personal setbacks, the kinds of stories that made audiences feel connected to common human experiences. They weren't supposed to confess to obliterating family legacies on national television. Sofia Petrov's great-grandmother, Ekaterina Petrova, had fled Russia in 1920 with nothing but the clothes on her back and a diamond sewn into the hem of her coat. She'd arrived at Ellis Island speaking no English, carrying no money, knowing no one, but possessed by an unshakable belief that America was where dreams grew from nothing into everything. For 30 years, Ekaterina had cleaned floors in Manhattan office buildings, saving every penny, learning English from discarded newspapers, building a foundation for generations she would never live to see prosper. She'd bought a small boarding house in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, where she housed other Russian immigrants and taught them the careful art of American survival. Ekaterina's daughter, Anya, had expanded the boarding house into a small hotel, then invested in the neighborhood properties that everyone said were worthless. She'd married a Polish immigrant named Pavel, and together they'd built what would become the Petrov real estate empire, modest by New York standards, but representing 4 generations of careful accumulation, strategic investment, and the kind of patient wealth building that immigrants understood was the only way to secure their families' futures. Sofia's grandmother, Natasha, had been the first Petrov woman to attend college, becoming a teacher while managing the growing portfolio of rental properties. Her daughter, Sofia's mother, Marina, had become a lawyer, expanding the family holdings and establishing the trust funds that would ensure the Petrov legacy lasted forever. Until Sofia discovered poker. "Mrs. Petrov," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. Something in Sofia's expression had triggered every instinct he'd developed over decades of reading people who carried unspeakable shame. "Tell me what you mean by that." The question opened floodgates that Sofia had been trying to keep sealed through months of denial, lies, and the growing realization that her addiction had consumed not just her own future, but the carefully constructed dreams of 4 generations of women who had sacrificed everything to build something lasting. My great-grandmother Ekaterina, Sofia began, her Russian accent thickening with emotion. She came to America with nothing. Nothing but faith that this country would let her build something for her family. She worked 16-hour days for 30 years, saved every penny, bought our first property in 19. The Petrov family stood at their team podium. Her teenage daughter Anastasia, her son Dmitry, her brother Alexei, and her elderly mother Marina, all of them shifting uncomfortably as their private catastrophe was exposed under studio lights. This game show appearance had been Anastasia's idea, a way to do something fun as a family, while avoiding the conversations they all knew needed to happen. 4 generations, Sofia continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears gathered in her eyes. 4 garrisons of women who never bought themselves new clothes so they could buy another building, who never took vacations so they could pay down mortgages, who never spent money on luxuries so their children could have something better. The rival family, the Washington clan from Georgia, stood frozen at their podium. They were working-class people who understood the value of hard work and sacrifice, who had never imagined that generational wealth could be lost as quickly as it was built. They'd come for fun and prizes, not to witness the collapse of an immigrant dream that had taken a century to construct. How much? Steve asked gently, though he suspected the answer would devastate him. Everything, Sofia answered immediately. The hotel in Brighton Beach that my great-grandmother bought with her life savings. The apartment buildings my grandmother purchased during the Depression when everyone said real estate was dead. The commercial properties my mother bought in the 80s when the neighborhood was gentrifying. The studio was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. 300 people held their breath as this woman revealed the scope of destruction that gambling addiction could wreak on a family legacy. 27 properties, Sofia said, her voice breaking. Built over 95 years, sold over 18 months to pay gambling debts. The last one closed yesterday morning. Brighton Beach Hotel, the place where 4 generations of my family learned what it meant to be American. Steve found himself moving closer to Sofia, drawn by recognition of a tragedy that transcended individual failure to become a betrayal of everything immigrants held sacred, the belief that sacrifice could build something lasting, that each generation could stand on the shoulders of the previous one, that the American dream was worth the price paid to achieve it. When did it start? Steve asked. 3 years ago, Sofia replied, looking out at the studio audience as if confessing to the ghost of every ancestor who had trusted her with their legacy. I went to Atlantic City with some clients to celebrate closing a big real estate deal. Just for fun, just to try the poker tables. I'd never gambled before in my life. She paused, lost in the memory of the moment when curiosity became compulsion, when entertainment became addiction, when a single decision began the avalanche that would bury 4 generations of dreams. I won $8,000 that first night, Sofia continued. $8,000 that felt like magic, like proof that I was special, that I had some kind of gift. I thought I was just smarter than everyone else at the table. The camera caught her mother Marina in the audience, tears streaming down her face, as she listened to her daughter describe the beginning of their family's end. Marina had built her law practice on the foundation of careful, conservative financial management, and she'd raised Sofia to understand that wealth was responsibility, not resource. How often did you go? Steve asked. Every weekend at first, Sofia answered. Then weekdays, then whenever I could get away from work. I told myself I was networking, meeting clients, building relationships, but really I was feeding something that got hungrier every time I fed it. The Washington family, their competitors in this forgotten game, found themselves emotionally invested in a story that challenged their understanding of how people lost everything. They'd always assumed that financial ruin came from external circumstances, job loss, medical bills, economic downturns. They'd never imagined that someone could choose to destroy their own family's foundation. I started borrowing against the properties, Sofia said. her voice growing stronger with the relief of confession. Just temporary loans, I told myself. Just enough to cover the losses until I could win it back. I was sure that my luck was about to turn, that the big win was just one more hand away. Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't just about gambling addiction. This was about the particular tragedy of losing wealth that hadn't been earned for personal pleasure, but built for generational security. Sofia hadn't just lost money. She'd lost the physical manifestation of a century of immigrant dreams. Your family, Steve said. Did they know? They trusted me, Sofia answered. And these 3 words carried more weight than any confession of guilt. I managed all the family properties, all the investments, all the financial decisions. They trusted me because 4 generations of Petrov women had been trustworthy. They never imagined that I would be the one to break the chain. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small black and white photograph, worn at the edges from decades of handling. It showed a young woman in a heavy coat standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, her eyes bright with hope and determination. This is Ekaterina, Sofia said, showing the photo to Steve. Taken the day she arrived at Ellis Island, and she kept this picture on her dresser for 60 years. And she'd show it to us grandchildren and say, this is the day our American story began. This is the day we decided to build something that would last forever. Steve studied the photo, seeing not just one woman's journey, but the beginning of a legacy that had just ended with her great-granddaughter's confession. What would she say to you now? Steve asked gently. I think she would say, Sofia replied, her voice thick with grief, that she should have stayed in Russia. That if she'd known her great-granddaughter would throw away everything she built, she would have stayed and taken her chances with the Bolsheviks. The studio audience began to react, not with applause but with the complex sounds of people processing a tragedy that felt both deeply personal and historically significant. Some were crying quietly. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that generational wealth could disappear as quickly as it was accumulated. Sofia, Steve said, using her first name now, making the connection more intimate. What's the last thing you lost? Yesterday morning, Sofia answered. I signed the papers to sell Brighton Beach Hotel to pay my final gambling debts. The hotel where my great-grandmother first learned to speak English, where my grandmother met my grandfather, where my mother studied for the bar exam, where I took my first steps as a baby. She paused, looking at her children who stood at the family podium, with expressions of grief and bewilderment that belonged on teenagers who had just learned that their secure future had been gambled away. The buyer is tearing it down next week, Sofia continued. 100 years of family history, 4 generations of dreams, 95 years of careful building gone, erased, as if none of it ever mattered. Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless stories of triumph and tragedy. But standing there looking at Sofia Petrov, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment value. He saw the end of an American dream, the collapse of everything that immigration was supposed to make possible. What's left? Steve asked. Nothing, Sofia answered simply. No properties, no investments, no trust funds for my children. No legacy to pass down. No foundation for the next generation to build on. Just debt, shame, and the knowledge that I destroyed something it took 4 generations to build. The camera caught her daughter Anastasia, 17 years old and college-bound, suddenly understanding that her future had been mortgaged for her mother's addiction. The college fund that had been growing since her birth was gone. The safety net that had supported 4 generations of Petrov women had been cut. But more than that, Sofia continued, I lost something you can never get back. I lost the right to be proud of my family's story. I lost the right to tell my children about their great-great-grandmother's courage, about their great-grandmother's sacrifice, about their grandmother's wisdom. Because now, when they think about the Petrov legacy, they won't think about 95 years of building. They'll think about 18 months of destruction. Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was charcoal gray, expensive, representing success, earned through hard work and careful decision-making. Sofia, Steve said, draping the jacket around her shoulders. This jacket represents something I built through decades of work. But you know what it doesn't represent? Sofia looked up at him, desperate for any perspective that might make sense of her devastation. It doesn't represent the end of your story, Steve continued. Your great-grandmother didn't come to America so that her legacy would be buildings and bank accounts. She came so that her family would have the freedom to fail, to fall down, and to get back up again. The jacket fit Sofia perfectly, but somehow it looked different on her than it had on Steve. Less like achievement and more like the possibility of redemption. Ekaterina, Steve said, looking directly at the photograph Sofia still clutched. She lost everything once too. She lost her country, her language, her entire way of life. But she didn't let that loss define her. She let it motivate her. Steve turned to address not just Sofia but her entire family, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that some stories weren't endings, but transformations. Your great-grandmother's American dream, he said, wasn't about accumulating wealth. It was about building the kind of family that could survive anything, that could start over when necessary, that could find strength in each other even when everything else was gone. He looked directly at Anastasia and Dmitri, Sofia's children who represented the fifth generation of Petrovs in America. You, Steve said to them, you are Ekaterina's American dream. Not the buildings that were sold, not the money that was lost, but the family that remains. The education she made possible, the opportunities she created, the freedom she won. That's still yours. The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about legacy, about what truly survives, about whether love could outlast loss. Sofia, Steve said, turning back to her, your great-grandmother's dream isn't dead. It's just starting over. The question is, are you going to honor her memory by giving up, or by showing your children what it looks like to rebuild from nothing? Sofia looked out at her family, at the audience, at the cameras that would broadcast this moment to millions of viewers, many of whom had their own versions of lost legacies, their own experiences with addiction, their own struggles with rebuilding after destruction. I've been going to Gamblers Anonymous for 6 months, Sofia said, her voice growing stronger. I've been clean for 93 days, and yesterday, after I signed the papers to sell the last property, I did something I should have done 3 years ago. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small business card, worn from handling. I called my daughter Anastasia and asked her to help me understand computer programming. Because if Ekaterina could learn English at 60, I can learn technology at 51. If she could build a business from nothing, I can build one too. Steve felt something shift in the studio atmosphere. This wasn't just a woman confessing to destroying her family's legacy anymore. This was someone discovering that legacy wasn't about what you inherited, but what you chose to build. We're starting a non-profit organization, Sofia continued, looking directly at her children. It's called Ekaterina's Dream. We help immigrant families understand financial literacy, addiction recovery, and how to protect generational wealth from the mistakes I made. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't typical game show applause. It was the sound of recognition, hope, of understanding that redemption was possible, even after the most devastating losses. Marina Petrov, Sofia's mother, left the family podium and crossed the stage to her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her publicly, for the first time since learning about the gambling debts. Your great-grandmother would be proud, she whispered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Not of what you lost, but of what you're choosing to build. 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a photo in the mail. It showed Sofia Petrov and her children standing in front of a small storefront in Brighton Beach. A sign in both English and Russian reading Ekaterina's Dream Financial Education Center. The note attached read, Mr. Harvey, we can't get back the buildings, But we're building something better, a legacy of helping families protect what our great-grandmother worked so hard to create. Today, Ekaterina's dream has helped over 300 immigrant families create financial safety nets and understand the warning signs of gambling addiction. Sofia speaks at conferences about generational wealth protection and addiction recovery, her story serving as both cautionary tale and proof that rebuilding is possible. Anastasia is studying business at Columbia University on academic scholarships, planning to expand her great-great-grandmother's legacy into the digital age. Dmitry has become an advocate for gambling addiction awareness among young people. And Sofia, 2 years clean, has learned that the most important inheritance she can give her children isn't money or property, but the knowledge that every ending can be a new beginning. The photograph of Ekaterina still sits on Sofia's desk, no longer a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what can be rebuilt with courage, honesty, and the understanding that American dreams aren't destroyed by failure, but by the refusal to start again. Sometimes the most important legacy you can leave isn't what you built, but what you taught others about building after everything falls down.